Hi, everyone.
Hello, world.
This is interesting. My name is Tavia Gilbert. I don't even know where to look. There we go. Being in this new COVID world is a very interesting thing, but it's lovely to have you here with us. I'm Tavia Gilbert. I am many roles in the genesis of Iphigenia Murphy, and I'm so proud and delighted to be with my friend and my collaborator and the wonderful writer, Sara Hosey, to talk about her amazing book, Iphigenia Murphy.
Thank you so much, Tavia. Tavia is an Audie-winning audiobook narrator who was absolutely the midwife to Iphigenia Murphy. And I hope that at some point during our conversation, we get a chance to talk a little bit about the various roles that she played as first reader, as first editor, first publisher, audiobook narrator. And she also has agreed today. I'm going to read for a couple minutes from the book. And then Tavia is going to read a little bit as well, which I think is such a wonderful thing. I mean, she's a professional. And it also gives you a sense of her as the narrator, which if you're an audiobook listener, I think that hopefully that might tempt you to go ahead and pick up a copy of Iphigenia Murphy on audiobook. What you should absolutely be doing as well, though, is buying a copy of Iphigenia Murphy at the Astoria Bookshop if you haven't already. And if you have already bought Iphigenia Murphy, maybe you'll get something else at the Astoria Bookshop. They're doing curbside delivery, and they're also shipping, I think, nationally. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just so important that there are democracy's bookstores, independent bookstores. That's what I say. And I'm so grateful that they offered to host today's event for many reasons. But I think it also just demonstrates that independent bookstores support authors, they support artists. And so let's support them back and show them some love, especially in this really kind of more difficult and challenging environment. So please do pick up something from the Astoria Bookshop today.
Absolutely. Yes. Sara, I want to jump in and say it's really special that we're doing this event at a Queens location. Yeah. Do you want to explain a little bit of the tie?
I would, thank you. Iphigenia Murphy is my love song to Queens, and it's a novel that I think could only take place in Queens. It takes place at a very specific time and place in Queens and Forest Park in the 90s. Yes, so even before I go forward with that, I would say that even though we're not in the Astoria Bookshop right now, my heart is there because my heart is always in Queens. And I put a lot of that into the novel. So the novel opens in Jackson Heights, which is, spitting distance from Astoria Bookshop. So there is I think a real important connection there. Place is so important, and maybe that's something that we will get a chance to talk about. But speaking of Queens and speaking of Forest Park, the novel is largely set in Forest Park, Queens, which in the 90s, sadly, was actually pretty dangerous. It was a pretty dangerous place. I think that these days, the Parks Department has actually paid it some attention, and it's been cleaned up significantly. But I think that in some ways that simultaneous wildness and freedom of the park, coupled with the kind of the dangerousness of it, is precisely what I was going for, and also kind of how I felt as a teenager coming of age in Queens. I think a couple of my high school friends actually may be on this. Yeah, give us a shout out, TMLA, if you are. But coming of age, becoming a teenager in the 90s in Queens, we had so much freedom, and we really, not only do we have Manhattan, but even within Queens itself, I think that, we were really able to kind of do lots of crazy things that I think teenagers these days, I hope, are not necessarily doing. And that was really cool and exciting, but it was also kind of scary. And I think that that's an aspect that I'm also trying to get at in Iphigenia Murphy, I believe, a little bit, with the idea that there's a dangerousness, but there's also something really seductive and exciting about the danger.
Yeah. Well, introduce us to Iphigenia. Who is Iphigenia Murphy?
So, well, and I'm going to jump into a section that I want to read, but I'll tell you what you need to know because it's pretty early. It's chapter 7 of the book. And she is a young woman. She's 15 years old, and she's living in an apartment with her father and her stepmother and her stepbrother. And she has been for years abused by her stepbrother. And this was important to me to dramatize sibling abuse, which I think is something that unfortunately is more common than many of us realize. And yet is something that you don't really hear a lot about. I think it's under dramatized in literature. The abuse that she has suffered has been escalating, and she decides at the beginning of the book to run away. She's been making plans to run away. And she plans to run away to Forest Park in particular because she believes, and there's a couple of different clues in the book to this, that her long lost mother may be living in the park. So up until the point that I'm going to read, she's run away. She's kind of set up a home. She's still on her own, although she's interacted with the stray dog that she's been feeding and that's kind of been lurking around her a little tentatively. And immediately before this chapter, she has approached a group of folks who appear to be homeless, and she's shown them a photograph that she has of her mother and asked if they know her, if they've seen her, and they don't. And there's one man there, and he kind of leers at her. I think it's sadly a familiar feeling for many of us. And he gives her kind of a creepy feeling, but she leaves the situation and she goes, and then I'm going to pick up reading immediately that evening after she has that encounter with those folks. So she's reminiscing first, I would say, about her stepbrother. You should be thanking me. You're so ugly. You should be thanking me. The way that man had looked at me, it brought it back in a way that left me unsteady. I felt nauseous and lightheaded. Those picnic table people had smelled. The one had looked at me like he wanted to hurt me. They had laughed at me. Of course they didn't recognize the picture. Had I really thought it was going to be that easy? I got a small campfire going. Maybe my stomach was upset because I hadn't eaten enough. But I wasn't hungry exactly. Actually, I was always hungry in a low, humming way ever since I got to the park, but I'd also been feeling a little sick in a way that was starting to make me nervous. I'd make myself a hot meal. It would smell good, I decided, and then I'd want to eat it. I put a pot of beans close to the flames. I stared into the fire, watching those beans cook and sizzle and bubble and thinking about my stepbrother. I hadn't let myself think about him, not really, not straight on since I'd left. What are you going to do about it? He'd sneer at me. Yo, you should be thanking me. I thought about my stepmother, sucking her lips at me, telling me she'd be happy to throw my skanky ass out on the street, blaming me, looking at me. You stay out of his room, she'd said, her lips twisted in contempt. Like I wanted to go in there. I thought about my father turning away from me. Shut the fuck up, my father said to everyone all the time, to the guy in the news, to my stepmother, to me, even if I wasn't trying to say anything at all. Shut the fuck up. I felt my face frowning as I stared into the fire. I heard a branch snap, like in the movies or something, and I sensed that someone was there just behind me and to the right. Then there was that guy straight up leering at me. It was the same small, bald, gray man from the picnic tables. Found you, he kind of chirped, his lips pulling back so he was baring his small gray teeth. I've been going over scenarios in my head for so long about what I would do if someone tried to bother me. Scream, run, punch them in the neck. But it didn't help all that thinking. It might have even made things worse. I was totally paralyzed, except for dropping the stick I was poking the fire with into the embers. Dinner, said the guy. I suddenly realized that he was holding a mean-looking knife at his side, pointed to the ground. It flashed into my head that I had seen knives like that in the Army-Navy store, knives for gutting fish, but I hadn't bought one. It also flashed into my head that my mace, which I had actually bought, was in my backpack on the other side of the fire. I reached out slowly to grab the pot of beans, which were getting too hot and making popping noises. I felt myself nodding, like I was agreeing to something. I should run, I thought. I stared into the fire and I imagined myself as though I was watching the scene in a movie, a skinny, dark-haired girl alone in the woods in the park. He would touch me. He would grab me with those small, cruel hands. His breath would be rotten. I needed to do something, to jump up, yell for help, anything. I needed to wake myself up, get up some courage, and fast. But the best I could muster was to mumble, leave me alone, into the fire. And in that moment, as though from a distance, I saw it all as so terribly unfair. Why, I couldn't help but wonder. Why me? Why don't they all just leave me alone? He took a step closer. You just relax, he said low, smiling. We're going to have a good time. And he took another step and he brought up the knife and he reached out and he grabbed me by my hair. He yanked me up. As he did so, I finally broke out of my daze. I was still holding the pot of beans, and as I rose, I pulled my arm back and whaled the side of his head with it. The pot clanked and fell to the ground. He made a weird, strangled noise and released me. I ducked away and looked at him. His face was covered in the hot beans. He had dropped the knife so he could frantically wipe at his eyes. I could tell it hurt, but it was also clear that he was surprised and maybe even a little embarrassed. But that didn't stop him from lunging at me again. Just as he was about to make contact, though, my black dog came flying out of the trees, literally flying. She launched at him, snarling and ripping at his shoulder. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. I just stood there, stunned. The man let out a high-pitched scream. The dog growled from where she landed in a crouch at the edge of the fire. The man flailed and kicked his leg out at her. She barked at him, her body inching forward with each bark. Quickly, I scooted over to the other side of the fire, closer to my backpack. What the? Get that dog away from me. He was scared now, angry but scared. It was like she pinned him with her gaze, and he couldn't take his eyes off her. Suddenly, I imagined a different ending to the scenario. Emboldened, I crouched down and grabbed my backpack. You should have left us alone, I growled. It also happened so fast. The guy was there, clutching his arm, looking frankly stunned, shocked. His shirt had been ripped, but I didn't see any blood, so I wasn't sure if she had bitten him or what. I saw him look to his knife nearby on the ground. In what felt like one motion, I unzipped my bag, reached in, and grabbed the pepper spray. From where I was squatting, I aimed the pepper spray through the flames and up at the man, so that when I pressed down, the spray created a brief, huge fireball that leapt up and engulfed the guy. His mouth was an O. His face, lit and surrounded, looked like something out of a horror movie. He jumped backwards, screaming, the front of his shirt on fire. He hit the ground and started flailing and rolling. I think he actually screamed something like, "Why are you doing this to me?" I took 2 paces around the fire, and then I hit him with the pepper spray itself. No fire this time. I sprayed him hard and long in his bean-covered face. He had rolled onto his side into a fetal position with his hands over his face, but I crouched down and I sprayed him again anyway. His face, from what I could see through the fingers, was puckered against my rage. I kicked him, feeling his torso both soft and solid through my sneaker. Whatever, I wasn't even that strong. But it felt good to kick him, to kick this creep, this would-be rapist, this terrible man. I had had enough. I had just had enough. So after I sprayed him good enough that he had to stop screaming and close his mouth shut, I kicked him all right, more than once. And then I picked up his terrible knife, stuffed my loose gear into a garbage bag, and grabbed my backpack and said, "Come on, dog," and we crashed off into the woods. So Tavia, I in part wanted to read that chapter. I had a lot of reasons for reading that chapter, and one of them is it's one of the first ones I wrote. And I think that in some ways I enjoy that chapter because it's kind of a vicarious living through of what happens when somebody kind of like fucks with the wrong girl. But she wasn't always the wrong girl. And that was something you revealed to me, Tavia, in many of our conversations. I often felt like Tavia has known more about the book or sensed things, got things about the book that I wasn't even getting. And you remarked to me once about Iffy's rage. And it was interesting to me because I do think that in some ways this is the arc of her narrative, is an arc to not only accessing that rage, but then learning how to deal with it. That part of her healing is to first allow herself to be angry, and then learning how to help deal with that anger in a healthy way. Here again, this guy deserves what he gets, right? But that kind of violence is not necessarily going to be the healthiest response to the injustices that she's faced, and instead she needs to figure out other ways to start fighting back.
Yeah, I think there are so many things that make your book unique and special. And for the people who are joining us today, this is Sara's brilliant debut novel. This is my 650-something book. So I've read widely as in my career as a narrator and in my training as a writer myself. And your book always stands out to me, no matter how many times I hear or read part of Iffy's story, it seems so special and the voice so unique. And part of that is that she is feeling her anger, feeling her feelings, and taking up space, but it's an act of self-discovery, not an act of violence. Even when she gets violent, it's like she's discovering what she's capable of, and that can be deep compassion and courage and absolute rage. I've not read a character like that before.
Pardon?
I have not read a character like that before. So I think but I recognize that the intensity of her feeling. You know?
And I think that, I would actually say maybe that brings us to the next section that we were going to read, because again, I would say that the arc, or the way I perceive the novel, but again, I would ask your opinion. I trust Tavia's takes more than my own. But the way I perceive the novel is that initially running away, removing herself, is what she needs to do to save her life. And when she's alone in the park, that's an important kind of pause. So she really is able to spend some time just getting in touch with like who she is, and thinking about her relationship with her mother and this longing for her mother that she has. And then she meets Angel, which is the black dog that we're introduced to here, and develops a relationship with this animal. But of course, as I think Iffy remarks in the book, Angel doesn't talk back. So there's still this opportunity for Iffy to start externalizing, to start communicating, and to start connecting. But Angel has her limitations, let's say. And then Iffy makes another friend, and so then this brings us to another kind of crucial part of her journey and part of her healing process, which is meeting Corinne, who I often perceive as kind of an older mentor character, who again, and has her own shit, has her own stuff going on, but is just old enough, just a little bit older enough than Iffy to be able to kind of have more of a bird's eye view of some of the issues that Iffy is dealing with. So if you're up for it, I would love it if you'll set up I can set up the chapter, or you could set up the chapter depending on what you're comfortable.
Yeah, why don't you, if you don't mind?
So as I suggested, this is a few chapters later. This is more like the middle of the book. So it's worth pointing out that it's early in the book that Iffy then channels that rage and throws the beans at the guy and kicks him and all this stuff. And then she continues with this dog to look for her mother and to assemble this life for herself. And then one night she sees someone's bag. It's under a railroad track, and she goes to investigate, and she winds up meeting another young woman who is running from a domestic violence situation. So this is Corinne. She's a little bit older than Iffy, and she's really on the run. She's fresh out of a really bad experience, but they kind of immediately connect. And I would say that part of that is, and I think this will come through a little bit in the section that Tavia reads, it, Corinne is like a really charismatic, frank and open person who calls it like she sees it, and is just the opposite of Iffy in many ways. Iffy's been very closed down and secretive, and she can't even really, in this chapter, bring herself to tell Corinne that she's looking for her mother. Like, Iffy's so used to guarding herself that she's not quite able to put herself out there, but she's like enamored with this person who seems to be able to put it on the table right away. And I think that's what you need to know. They've just met, and they're walking back to Iffy's camp to get a bite to eat and to set up for the night.
Great. The rain had stopped while Corinne and I were talking, and we headed over to my camp. Hiking through the woods, she told me stories about Prince, her dog, and how she bought him at a pet store, even though you're not supposed to do that, but how it was just so sad and pathetic she couldn't leave him there. And about Henry, her ex-boyfriend, and how it was love at first sight, but now he was deadly. Literally deadly, girl, she said. And about her mother, who sometimes got religion and started speaking in tongues, which Corinne loudly imitated, her voice ricocheting through the woods. I nodded and laughed at the right times, marveling all the while at this girl's ease. at how easy she made talking seem, at how easy she made it to be with her. When we got to my spot, we sat on a log while she scarfed down a can of cold lentil soup. When she finished, she was suddenly quiet and looked at me expectantly, like it was my turn to tell her something. I knew that this was how it worked with friends, especially girlfriends. I thought, what can I tell her? There was something I was ashamed of, but which I knew I should probably get out in the open. I began. She waited, her face serious and alert. So, like at night, I sometimes chew my thumb? She paused. Do you mean you suck your thumb? She asked, not able to restrain her smirk. I mean, it's just the edge, I began, my face getting hot. Whatever. She laughed. That's cute. I shut my eyes. Why couldn't I be a normal person? Honestly, I really don't care. So tell me, she said, mercifully changing the subject. Anybody give you a hard time out here all on your own? I told her about the time the guy with the knife tried to grab me and how I threw the beans at him and all that. When I was done, she looked at me like I was crazy, and then she started laughing. Well, check out skinny little you. I bet he was surprised. How sneaky with the pepper spray. Saint Sneak, that's what I'll call you. Patron saint of the gutter punks. I laughed. I wish I had been there. She jumped up and bent both arms, like bodybuilders do when they want to show off their muscles. We would have showed that guy. Me and Saint Sneak. She kissed each bicep in turn. We'd be like superheroes. Well, I said, feeling good. Feeling, I don't know, like I could be funny too. You know, not to brag or anything, but I kind of did. Show him. You know, by myself. Oh, yeah? She laughed, sitting back down. Is that right? She said, all sass to Angel. The dog, loving the attention, danced around her and then lunged forward to lick Corinne's face. Ouch! Corinne winced and protected her face with her forearm. And gross, dog, she complained, pushing Angel off her, but Angel kept jumping back. I'm going to jump down just a little bit here on the page, jump into a slightly different. So then, like, what's the long-term plan? What are you going to do? What do you mean? I mean, dummy, she said, shaking her head, rising to dig out her cigarettes. So you get assaulted by, like, a rapist, child molester monster or something, and then you're like, okay, that's cool, nighty-night. Well, I was pretty scared. Exactly. But where am I supposed to go? I don't know. How about anywhere besides Forest Park? I kind of laughed. She was right, of course. I wasn't ready to tell her the rest. To tell her about my mother. To tell her I couldn't leave until I found her or until I knew for sure she wasn't in the park anymore. I knew it would sound too crazy. Where else is there? Corinne was serious. I don't know. I really don't. She picked a leaf and stripped it down with her fingers, the shreds falling. It might be better to, like, live in the subway. Or really, I mean, home can't be all that bad, can it? I think I like the monsters here better than the ones at home. That's a good stopping point.
Okay. What about you? I could have listened to you all day. So I was totally into it.
One of the things that I love about this story, another part that makes it so stand out to me, is that this is such a beautiful story of friendship. Iffy and Corinne don't come from the same world. They have many things that are different about them, but they love each other and they take care of each other. They find ways to protect and watch out for and help one another on the way. And that is such a powerful thing to have in a story that is written, I think, for young adults, but is absolutely readable by so many different demographics of people. I think that this is a really widely appealing story because it is about friendship. It is about finding your place, finding your voice, discovering what your sense of the world and your place in it and your responsibility to it are. So,
and I've asked a couple times, you know, who, I don't know how it was phrased. It was something like, oh, well, is Iffy you? Iffy is not me. Iffy is my heart. I love Iffy. And I was asked, well, who's the character you most identify with? And I identify with them all, but I do kind of find myself identifying with Corinne more than Iffy, in that I have this great affection for Iffy, but I also have this kind of big sisterly kind of affection for her. And I think that, you know, like I said earlier, Corinne has the perspective of someone who, again, doesn't have it all worked out for herself, but certainly is able to perceive things about Iffy that surprise Iffy. So in the section that you're reading a little bit later, she says, Iffy's been calling herself Brenda, you know, for some reason she's not ready to give her real name. And she says, well, what's your real name anyway? And Iffy is so transparent in some ways to Corinne. And it's ways that Iffy often finds really surprising. I think it's also worth mentioning, and it's something that comes up a little bit later in the book, that Corinne is also trans, which is something that people have asked me about, why I included a trans character in Iphigenia Murphy. And I have a couple different answers, and one of them is that Corinne just kind of walked into the park fully formed. I didn't really have a lot to do with manipulating her character. That Iffy was in my imagining of the story, Iffy was living in the park and this person came in, and then Corinne just kind of wrote herself, which seems pretty consistent with her character. But I also, and this is something that Tavia and I have talked a lot about, needed to be really careful, I think, because on the one hand, I didn't want Corinne's depiction to be exploitative, and I didn't want Corinne's depiction to perpetuate any of the kind of transphobic thinking or even language that was pretty current or dominant in the 90s. At the same time, it would have been anachronistic for Iffy to have a kind of like intersectional feminist approach to, you know, trans rights. And so there is a little bit of friction there where, you know, Corinne kind of says, well, by the way, I'm trans. And Iffy's not really even sure what that is, but knows that she really likes Corinne and kind of is able to get over it, you know, immediately, pretty quickly at least. And so that was important to me because I felt that on the one hand, you know, again, to just suggest that like, well, everybody had a 21st century understanding in 1992 would have been a disservice. But to then replicate also some of the other kind of ugliness of 1992 would also perhaps have been a disservice. And this, again, was a conversation that I was able to have with you and Kathy Plord, who is one of our collaborators, pretty early on in the drafts. And then later on as well, kind of just being super careful with some of the language even that's used around these issues.
Yeah, we did have many conversations and sensitivity readers, and just tried to be really thoughtful and responsible about how we approached some of the content of the book, because it's charged. So sexual abuse and violence and domestic violence in relationship, you know, we were rigorous, we thought, but we also, the characters are who they are. So what I love about Iffy hearing from Corinne that she's trans is there is a process of evaluating what she feels about it herself, and then she kind of is like, you're my friend, you're okay, let's move on with the rest of the story. And it was, I appreciate the realistic touch and the that it didn't take over your narrative.
Mm-hmm. If people have questions, I think write them out. I don't see any questions, but feel free to ask questions. But I would say that this is a place to talk a little bit. I would love to share a little of our publishing journey, and interrupt or you know, interject when you have something to add. But I would say that I wrote this novel, and I kind of put it in a drawer, and I didn't think about it. And then I recruited again, and I sent it to a handful of like agents and traditional publishing houses. And I would say that I did get some interest. There was some interest there, but it never, never kind of went past kind of like, we really like it, but kind of thing. And I realized, and I think this is an important lesson for authors, that I really needed to be much more clearly targeting, who I was querying. And at that point, I changed my search, and it probably literally changed to like feminist publishers, And sadly, this was 5 or 6 years ago now, maybe even more than that. The search was pretty limited, what I came up with. So there's like the feminist press, which does mostly classic novels, but kind of is a self-proclaimed, as its title is, the feminist press. And then I came across this really cool small publishing company called Animal Mineral Press, which had an imprint called Great Cranberry. Did I get that right? Great Cranberry?
Yeah.
Oh, for a long time, I guess. But on their website, they said, we're looking for bold feminist stories, and I was like, hallelujah, it was my people. I found my people, and I submitted to you and Kathy. So this was Tavia's publishing company. I submitted, and I heard from you pretty swiftly after that, which I'm going to defer to you now. But I would say the lesson that when I'm asked about, when authors are asking me, well, what was your journey, or do you have any advice? My advice is, when you find your people, if they're out there, there's a connection like that. That was really, that was the moment. And it also taught me that I was really spinning my wheels and not doing some research before I was shooting off queries to people who this was not their interest at all. So I found my people.
Yeah. I remember the feeling that I got when I read your query letter, which was about Iphigenia. And I thought, oh, I want to get to know that girl. There was an energy and a confidence and a groundedness, perhaps because you felt like you were sending it to the right place. But that like deep connection came through before I read a word of your manuscript. And so I think that's a good lesson for authors, is that when you've done the preparation and you feel like you're a company who's going to want to hear from me, and I know why.
That's a way of putting it, yeah.
Then you can put your whole confident self.
I was like, yes, please. We should work together.
Yeah.
And I have to say that at the time too. Now in hindsight, Tavia and Kathy worked with me extensively on revising the manuscript. And I think that on the one hand, I hadn't found the right publishers. I hadn't found the right house. But I think also, and I hate to say this, but it's probably true, it wasn't quite where it needed to be. And you all, it was because of you and Kathy that I had the sensitivity readers, that I did some major revisions, including, I'm going to do a spoiler alert, but I'm assuming that if you're watching this, you have read the book. So I'm going to give a little spoiler alert, that Iffy is in fact pregnant, which was something that when I had written the first drafts was in my head. Like I had thought about that, and I was like, well, maybe I'll suggest it. Like every so often she'll get sick. And Kathy and Tavia said, this was a question we had because we know she's coming out of this abusive situation, and she's a 15-year-old girl. This would be a possibility. And it also seems like it would kind of change the stakes of the novel. And I was like, you're absolutely right. Yes, she is pregnant, or at least believes that she may be, throughout most of the novel, or has this suspicion that she may be. And it does really change the novel to have included that. But it was something that was like, I was almost holding back. I was keeping to myself. And it was through working with you two, and as I said, doing really extensive revisions that I was able to get the novel where it needed to be.
Yeah. I mean, I remember saying, I feel like you're pulling your punch there. And you were like, oh yeah, I think I am.
Right. But that's working with someone, working not only with a great publisher, but also with a great editor. And, I really, and I've said this before, and I will say it, I'm sure many more times, and with collaborators, that I love that, this is my book and my name is on it, but it's our book in many ways. And I feel that really deeply.
It's so generous that you say that. And I also think from my own career as a performing artist, I don't make my best work by myself. My work grows in collaboration. And so for an artist to hold the idea that it's a solitary journey from idea to finished product ready for a marketplace that's I'm not sure how to find those always. I think we have to be creative. So we worked together extensively on the manuscript. When I started narrating, I always worked with a director. And I think finding ways to bring collaboration into your life, even when we're in this environment of working from home, through screens, not always face to face, but using whatever tools and resources you have to get the very best piece of art finished. That is my recommendation. So.
And the next part of the story, which is just we'll go briefly over, is that then unfortunately though Animal Mineral collapsed to a certain extent, right? Did not feel that they would going to be able to get out the book, which was sad for everyone.
Yeah, we had, what we found was publishing is enormously difficult, and that the people who do it the best are not, we could not execute at the level of excellence that we wanted. We had one really excellent title in nonfiction that we are still so proud of. And then we got to the point of thinking we're now going to produce this second title and it deserves even more than we have to offer. We want it to have the best home. We recognize that's not us any longer. And so we sort of all grew together and we found you a home that I think has represented the title beautifully and with the integrity that we all began the project.
Yeah.
But taking it into the world at a much higher level than we could do.
So, and then as I mentioned earlier, and as I'm sure you could tell from her reading, I was lucky enough to have Tavia as the narrator of the book. So it was something that was important to me going into the relationship with Blackstone, which they were totally amenable. They love her. She's worked with them many times. But also you insisted on auditioning though, nevertheless.
Yeah,
right?
I wanted you to have
something that I had felt very strongly about.
Yeah, I think again, like trying to get your ego out of the way of your work makes for better art. So you were able and willing to collaborate so deeply on the making of your manuscript, and then I wanted you to choose the very best narrator for the job, and I wanted it to be me, but I didn't want to impose that on yourself.
It certainly was you, absolutely. So. No, are there no questions? We don't have any questions? Hold on. Hi, Andrea. This is one of my Mary Lewis friends. It says, reading
nice.
Now, halfway through and love it. Would love to hear about how you got your idea and inspiration. Thanks, Andrea. Thank you for listening or watching, and thank you for the question. I love you and I miss you. And, the ideas came from so many different places. I would say that there is one story in particular. I'm going to tell one story and then I'm going to go broad. But I did have a dog. I was living in Richmond Hill. I did have a dog named Angel who ran away from home. And it was very tragic and it was upsetting. And we hung up signs everywhere. And she was a shelter dog who was extremely neurotic. And my biggest fear when she ran away was that she was going to bite somebody, because she was so skittish that she was the kind of dog, like if you went to pet her and she didn't know, she would faint like she was going to bite you. And we never found her. But a few weeks after she ran away, we did get a phone call from someone who said that they had seen her in Forest Park with someone who appeared to be homeless. And I had kind of two simultaneous reactions to this. And one was great relief that Angel had a person, but then also this anxiety and worry about both of them, that, I find it particularly heartbreaking when folks who don't have enough for themselves take on the responsibility for something else or someone else. I think it's a beautiful thing, but I also know that it's not an easy thing. And I would always look for them in Forest Park when we lived over there. I was always on the lookout for a black dog with a ridiculous tail. And I would go through scenarios in my head, like, what would I do if I found them? Like, I wouldn't want to take the dog away from this person who was its new custodian and who was caring for it and maybe didn't have that much in their lives. At the same time, I wouldn't want to see either of them struggle or suffer. And I think the other thing that happened as I began to imagine this and I began to notice is I also began to notice a lot of the folks in need around me at all times. And sadly, I think, we're so inured to struggling and suffering, and we're so good at making people invisible, the people that we don't want to see, that it really started to pop for me how many people there were in need around me in a relatively, working or middle class neighborhood. So that was kind of like one of the instantiating ideas when I started to imagine, like, who is Angel with, and who is this person, and how did she wind up homeless, and why is she living in Forest Park? And I also kind of created this Angel character who was she's more of a composite of the dog that I lost and my current dog, the current dog I have, Jenny, is she's also a rescue dog, but she's like a much more enthusiastic, bounding around, confident dog. So this Angel in the book has a little bit of both of those. And then the other major source of inspiration for me have been many of my friends who have struggled with housing precarity and who have struggled with abuse, and violence. It's an homage to them in some ways. I think some of them know who they are that I'm talking about, who have often also been invisible, or their struggles and their suffering has often been invisible. And yet, they have persevered and they've survived and they have thrived. So I think that was my two kind of sources of inspiration. One was thinking through the folks that really are all around us and what their stories are and how they wound up where they are, as well as kind of thinking through the folks that I know who've been that person, but who have also sort of made it.
Sorry, I've been muting because there's lots of life still going on right outside my apartment building. I feel like the thing that I appreciate about Blackstone publishing this title and that I loved about having a hand in bringing it to life is that you're talking about issues that I think lots of people feel it's sort of outside. It's not housing precarity. That's such a prevalent experience for people in our country, feeling alone and in need of healthcare or of help. Safety, that's why I say this book was written for young adults, but it spans demographics because these are serious issues that so many people have experienced. I myself have experienced some of the things that go on in the book. So it's, telling that story so that it's not about those issues necessarily, but that's an undercurrent of Iffy finding herself in this coming of age story that, how many coming of age stories have there been in the world, but including the reality of modern day and being serious about it, but not getting swept away through that, if that makes sense. I really appreciate all that Iffy realistically is dealing with.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from my friend Jennifer Pupa. Hi, Jen. How did you decide which popular cultural references to include or exclude? Well, this is an easy one for me to answer, Jennifer, because I clearly had to include a reference to Beverly Hills 90210, which happens early. She's a fan as well. That happens early that she talks about Beverly Hills with her friend Lizette, because that was like totally in the water, I felt at the time. I mean, for many years, it was in the water for me, but at least when it first came out, it was a phenomenon. Do you remember those days when, it was network and I guess cable, but really it was a television event. We all watched it with our friends. Although Iffy in the book is a little disconnected from that. but she does assume Brenda's name in the book, right? Because this is like in the forefront of her head. When she is called upon to come up with an alias, like the first name she comes up with is Brenda, and she's thinking of Brenda Walsh. In terms of choosing the references, I think that I did try to be a little bit deliberate with some of it. And this may have also been in response to some notes from you, Tavia, and from Kathy, to ground the reader in the early 90s, because I think that it would be easy to not know where you were in time in terms of some of the other events of the novel, which are not necessarily time bound, right? But in order to kind of make clear that we were in this cultural moment, there were a couple, like I referenced, I think Mortal Kombat and Beverly Hills 90210, and I'm trying to think if there's other things. Oh, well, she's, Iffy is just beginning to get into music, which is also an interesting, I think, coming of age experience. So it happens for some people younger than others, but I think that when you start listening to the radio, as was the case when we were younger, right, and you start becoming discriminating about what it, it's not just like, I'm just going to listen to Hot 95, or I'm just going to listen to what my parents listen to, or my older brother listens to, but I'm going to start figuring out what it is that I like, I think is a huge part of coming into an adult identity. And it just kind of, as a side note, is interesting because I have kids and they don't have a radio, which is so weird to think about, like they don't get to make that kind of determination. So I got them an Alexa, and they do have taste, like they have the things that their peers have told them is cool, or that's on the shows that they watch, and they're starting to inflict that upon us too often. But it is an interesting, kind of cultural shift, the kind of radio days to now. I guess kids mostly find music on YouTube, would be my guess. But that's an important part of Iffy's development, is like she likes the Ramones and she's kind of drawn to like punk, but she doesn't have, and again, it's kind of hard to remember these days when we didn't have the internet, but she doesn't have access. She doesn't have the information. She kind of asks the guys at school for recommendations, and she tries, when she listens to the radio, she tries to make it to the break to hear the DJ say who it was that they were just playing. And that's a kind of a struggle, that's not easy to do. So that's where it's coming from with some of the pop culture stuff.
Yeah. We have two really lovely comments that I'll share. Richard, you're saying what I did not say so artfully, but you say a real strength is the way the book makes visible class-based and socioeconomic issues as their own thing, neither subsuming them nor divorcing them from other issues. Yes, exactly. And I appreciate that so much as well. And then Lisa, you said that you appreciate the yearning for Iffy's mother, that you feel like so many people yearn for their mothers in various ways, but it's unrepresented in media. Mm. And Iffy's mother is a flawed character. She's not an idealized mother. And but Iffy wants her, needs her, yearns for her nonetheless. And I think that that's so true. We take our loved ones as they come to us, and everybody needs their mom. So I also really love Iffy's love for her mother.
And I do find that true, Jen, or often, that even when our mothers are not awesome moms, we long for them. We long for whatever it was we didn't maybe even get. So I love to tell the story of Iffy's name, which I've talked about in other places, but maybe some people haven't heard. And it's from the Greek play, the Oresteia. And in the Oresteia, there's a character, Agamemnon. He's been at the Trojan War, and he wants to get home. Actually, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. He wants to attack, but the winds are not blowing. And so in order to get the winds to blow, he has to make a sacrifice, and he sacrifices his daughter, Iphigenia, and the winds blow, and he is able to accomplish his mission. And you may recognize that plotline. I'm talking to you, Jen, and Frank Pupa again. You may recognize that because they totally steal that plot for Game of Thrones. I can't remember the guy's name. He kills his daughter so that he can have success in battle. But unlike in Game of Thrones, in the Oresteia, Iffy's mother is pissed off. So when Agamemnon gets home from the Trojan War, he is murdered by Iffy's mom. Now she has a couple of agendas there, but one of them is, you killed my daughter. And this story, the first time I ever read it was in college, and it resonated really deeply with me because perhaps not unlike Iffy's mother, Clytemnestra is not
an ideal.
She's not an ideal person, but somebody messed with her daughter. And wouldn't we all, isn't that the dream, that your mother would protect you from anything, right? That this is what mother love is in the end. And her mother avenges her. So this is both what Iffy desires in the book, but it's also, it's in the novel, there's a moment when Iffy finds her mother's community college textbooks and her course breakdown. And I wanted to suggest that Christina kind of knew what she was doing. She took this class on Greek tragedy, and she thought this was a cool name. And she also had perhaps even this premonition that she was going to have to protect her daughter. But she chooses this really significant and difficult name that everyone mispronounces. I had a conversation with my friend Emelina about this, the ways in which people will mispronounce her name. And that's what makes her embrace Iffy as a nickname, which I think also has many other resonances and possibilities as a nickname. But by the end of the novel, she's Iphigenia. And by the end of the novel, she, it has kind of leaned into this legacy and this heavy story of her name and where it came from and why her mother chose it, and is insisting that people call her by it, which was also kind of comes back to another conversation that Tavia and I had, and then I had with Blackstone as well, about the title of the book. There was just very well-meaning, like, do you really want to call the book something that readers are not going to be able to pronounce? And I believe we discussed, do you remember this conversation, Tavia? Mm-hmm. And you were pretty, we agreed pretty passionately that we wanted to give give the book the name of this girl, even if it was hard to pronounce.
Yeah. I just got one more comment that came in that I think is so lovely. Happy to see the most insightful person in English class write her own novel. So your tribe is delighted for you and by you.
Thank you, Dawn. Oh, that's so nice.
We're coming close to the top of the hour, and so I don't want to hold people too long. But I do think maybe in closing, could you talk a little bit, Sara, about your dreams and plans for Iffy's future, where you might go next, or what you're working on? Is there another novel in the works?
Oh, I would love to talk about a couple of things that I have coming out. And then I would love to talk about what we're collaborating on, TV, if that's okay with you. Yes, I have a short story coming out in a literary magazine, the Casino Literary Magazine, in the summer. It's called Revenge of the Nerds. It is not for young adults. I mean, it's actually about a young adult, but it's not for the faint of heart. It's actually about a 15-year-old girl from Wisconsin who runs off with a guy she meets on the internet. And I think that there are some overlaps with Iphigenia Murphy. But again, it's not a short story that would be everybody's cup of tea. And then in the fall, winter, I have a novella coming out from Running Wild Press, the novella is called tentatively Great Expectations. And it's about a relationship between an aunt and a daughter that winds up becoming a really mutually sustaining and lifeline for both of them. And again, I think there's a lot of overlaps with Iphigenia Murphy, but I think that really Great Expectations is the angle of adults who yearn for their children but are unable for whatever reason to really kind of functionally parent them. The other thing that Tavia and I have been working on with our collaborator, Kathy, is adapting the Iphigenia Murphy book into a teleplay. We would love to start pitching that to see if we could get some interest in like a streaming series. And so I don't know, Tavia, can you talk a little bit about that?
I think it's in early days, but the thing that I think lends itself so beautifully is that there is an arc, there is a journey. We don't know where Iffy's going for the rest of her life, but she definitely goes on a very clear hero's journey and coming of age story to me, but in a setting. You talked at the top of the hour about the sense of place, that the setting and time are so key, and it's epic, and yet we're right in Iffy's journey. So I think it's such a personal story that really lends itself to that, the intimacy of a screen adaptation, a short run. So we're working on that, and I think we all just fell in love with Iphigenia and can't let her go. So we'll stick with her as long as she wants to be with us. Yeah.
And thank you everybody who tuned in. And I really appreciate your comments and everything. And I hope to see some of you soon.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Support Astoria Bookshop, please. Yeah, please pick up.
Yes.
They've got lots of other wonderful books and toys and puzzles and other cool stuff. Thank you.
Thank you all.